Hello everyone, welcome to End of the Journey, One Cruise Ends, Another Begins at Seatrade Cruise Virtual. Just to let you know, this session will be available on the platform after we've finished airing, so if you have to leave for any reason, don't worry, you don't have to miss out. And now I would like to introduce Marcus Puttich, Head of Port and Ground Operations, Incident Commander, TUI Cruises, and Simone Tommaso Maraschi, Managing Director of Cruise Gate Hamburg. We're going to be joining them in the terminal and on board Mindshift 2, where they will be talking us through how the resumption of turnarounds have gone so far and what can be done in the future to improve operations. Marcus and Simone, take it away.
So dear all, my name is Marcus. I'm the head of port and ground operations at TUI Cruises in Hamburg. I'm also one of the 3 incident commanders at our cruise line. And we are here right in front of the Steinwerder cruise terminal in Hamburg, where we will show you today how turnaround operations are working under COVID-19 conditions. Today I'm joined by the managing director of the Cruise Gate Hamburg, the terminal operator in our beautiful city, Simone Maraschi.
Good morning, Marcus, and good morning, Seatrade community.
We would like to let you know before that inside the terminal and actually outside the terminal, there is the mandatory face shield or mask. However, we decided just for recording purposes to not wear any, but however, we will keep the necessary distance. So, as you might know, the last months have been quite difficult. We have gone from good to bad to worse. However, we never rested and we always tried to get back into the cruise market. Currently, TUI Cruises has 3 ships deployed on the 7 seas, and today we will show you how we have been doing this. So when we started in May to draw down our return to service processes, we sat together with a number of authorities here in Hamburg, as well as the German port community. Beginning from the port captains in Hamburg, in Kiel and Bremerhaven, but also with different ministries, with health authorities and port authorities. We designed the processes in a way that we mitigate the risk as much as possible, but we are still able to offer a cruise holiday to our guests in a perfectly fine way. How we did this is the aim of today's presentation or today's walk through the terminal, where Simone will be joining me. And it has been a long way. We started in May to define the processes, and then by June we had those ready, and we discussed for a couple of weeks with the authorities. We did minor changes, pretty much we also then discussed with the Cruise Gate Hamburg how we can do turnaround operations inside the terminal. TUI Cruises return to service documentation is pretty much based on the EU Healthy Gateway guidelines, as well as the recommendations by Germany's Robert Koch Institute, but we are also taking into consideration several other objectives and regulations, for example, also from CDC in the US and from other authorities. How we did this, we will show you later on.
Yes, maybe I'd like to add a few things about Cruise Gate Hamburg. We operate all the 3 terminals in Hamburg, and we are in charge for berth allocation and destination marketing. During all the lockdown and basically the entire COVID-19 crisis, Hamburg had a very practical approach. We had around 11 ships here, which were able to repatriate the crew, and we started very early to discuss about restarts. The approach was very pragmatical, and together with the cruise line and its stakeholders, we were able to start at the end of June with the first calls, and then in July with 2 cruises. And so far we had around 45 calls, which is quite a good number. But I'm very happy that the working relationship and the support of the entire community and the authorities was very good.
All right, so without further saying too much, we will simply now give you a walk through the terminal and our operations inside. Part of TUI Cruises' healthy return to service concept includes a lengthy health questionnaire, which all guests have to fill out prior the start of the cruise. So outside of the terminal, TUI Cruises ground handling is collecting those health questionnaire on our beloved check-in counters, which we also have with acrylic glass in order to protect the ground handling staff.
Okay, we are here at the entrance of the terminal, and as you can see on my back, we have produced a series of signage which will guide the guest throughout the whole boarding process. And here, of course, we remind the guests to wear the mask and nose protection. As Marcus was mentioning before, we equipped each counter in the terminal with a plexiglass to protect most stuff. We are now entering the terminal, and as you can see, we have equipped some critical areas like the entrance, the check-in counter, and the security areas with extra disinfection dispenser.
All right, so welcome to the cruise terminal Steinwerder in Hamburg.
Es wird ein bisschen dicht vielleicht. Danke.
So we have now entered the terminal, and as you've seen, we've gone through a temperature check. The temperature check is compulsory for everyone entering the terminal. Means crew, employees, agency, truck drivers. Once in the terminal, we have placed on the floor a series of stickers which remind the guests to keep the security distance, as you can see on the floor here, and extra signs all over the terminal to remind the guests always to keep the 1.5 meter distance. Marcus?
Yes, so when we talk about check-in procedures for guests, the same rules that Simone just mentioned also apply. All guests entering the terminal have to disinfect their hands. They will go through the temperature screening, and as we have seen outside, also the health questionnaire will be taken and checked by our ground handling staff. They will then queue inside the terminal, always keeping a distance of at least 1.5 meters to each other. And once they are ready to be checked in, they simply walk to the check-in counters by the terminal, which the terminal has also fixed with acrylic glass in order to protect the staff behind. What we have changed at TUI Cruises in the last months is that we have gone to a complete digital check-in process. So the guest has to register online and gets what we call a ship's pass, like a boarding pass, to the vessel online, either on their mobile devices, or they can also print out. Coming to the check-in, what they will do is they will simply present their ID, either passport or general ID. They will place it here, and behind the counter we do have our ship staff checking in, and they do this with mobile devices in order to create a touch-free check-in process. Also, furthermore, in order for everybody to keep safe at all times. So inside the terminal, we will now present you our check-in processes here at TUI Cruises. As we have mentioned before, a public health questionnaire will be screened by our ground handling staff. Also, TUI Cruises is enforcing a COVID-19 test for all crew and guests getting on board the ship, and this will also be done in the check-in area. Once the guest is entering the terminal, a temperature check will be taken when they're entering. A secondary screening area is for anybody who is displaying or announcing symptoms to TUI Cruises. Part of our check-in process is a so-called staggered check-in, and maybe Simone can say a little bit more to this.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. In order to guarantee the safety distance of 1.5 meters within the terminal, we had to limit the amount of guests at the same time inside the terminal. So we discussed with the cruise line and the ground handler about the slot management, where the guests receive a time window where they are allowed to arrive to the terminal and proceed to check-in counters.
So inside the terminal, the wearing of a face mask is mandatory for all, not just for crew and ground handling staff, but also for our guests at any time. Our check-in staff is checking our guests in with mobile devices in order to mitigate touch points as much as possible. We are also equipping our counters with acrylic glass in order to protect the crew, but also in order to protect our guests. The boarding pass is already presented to the guests in their online check-in at home, either on a digital way, so they have it on their mobile device, or they can simply print out and take it here to the check-in area. The boarding card will distribute it to the guest once they have boarded the vessel and once they reach the cabin. For our stevedores, we have also implemented certain regulations that call for personal protective equipment, for example, wearing a mask and wearing gloves when they are handling the luggage of our guests. Our healthy return to service concept at TUI Cruises is based around the pillar of reduced capacity. Currently, all ships in the fleet are sailing with a maximum of 60%, which we have also registered with the authorities in all the countries we sail. As mentioned before, the COVID-19 test requirement has been implemented for all guests and crew that enter the vessel. Also mandatory at TUI Cruises is a public health questionnaire, which is obliged to be handed in at the check-in. After all the guests have left the vessel, we do have a sanitation barrier of a couple of hours in place, where we sanitize the entire vessel in order to have a clean ship for the next cruise to start. TUI Cruises is communicating all the healthy return to service concept measures to our guests in advance of the cruise as well as during the cruise. TUI Cruises is cooperating with the SGS Fresenius Institute that is checking on our health return to service concept. Daily temperature checks are mandatory for all guests and crew throughout the cruise. On board the Mein Schiff fleet, we have implemented a social distancing regulation that calls for 1.5 meters between each other. On the outside decks and between the sun chairs, a 2.0 social distance is required. Inside the sports area, there's a social distancing regulation of 3.0 meters at any given time. We have reduced the capacity on all public areas that include all bars, all restaurants, and all theaters on board. On board our fleet, we have also implemented a crowd control team. They are in charge that the social distancing regulations are met at any given times in all areas of the vessel. The wearing of a face mask is mandatory whenever the 1.5 meter social distancing regulation cannot be met. This, to put it simply, is everywhere, for example, in cabin hallways, in staircases, and in elevators. Elevators also have a reduced capacity of currently 4 guests at any time. On board the Mein Schiff fleet, all our crew is wearing a face mask at any given time. In regards to health regulations and hospital, TUI Cruises has a new position on board, our infection control officer. He is in charge for all the procedures that we have implemented in our healthy return to service concept. In addition, we have equipped our hospital with real-time PCR laboratory equipment. Besides having a real-time PCR on board, we are also able to do antigen tests at any time while we are sailing. In regards to crewing, our policies have changed as well. Whenever a crew member is signing on, they have to present a negative PCR at the gangway. Furthermore, all crew members are going into a 14-day quarantine before they are allowed to work on board the ship. Also for crew, TUI Cruises is taking daily temperature checks while we are sailing. So as all of you may have heard, the Mein Schiff 6 had an apparent 12 cases of crew members that were tested positive. I would like to also say a couple of words to this. TUI Cruises has implemented a 14-day testing for all crew members on our active vessels. It's a random testing. That means we are testing part of the crew every 14 days on a PCR basis. This we also did with the Mein Schiff 6 in Heraklion. And after we sailed, we received the note that apparently 12 crew members are tested positive. In close collaboration with our Greek authorities and our Greek colleagues, we were able to continue the cruise towards Piraeus, as we have tested all those 12 cases on board with our real-time PCR. So what happened on board? On board TUI Cruises, we have a COVID-19 response plan. So whenever there is an apparent positive case, that person, no matter if guest or crew, will be isolated immediately. Also, we are able to trace the contact group 1. So of those 12 crew members, we had 24 contact group 1 person that also went into isolation. So those 12 and those 24 were all crew. On board, we retested on a PCR real-time test. All those showed to be negative. Upon arrival in Piraeus, we did another antigen test. We did those for those 12 cases as well as for the 24 contact group 1 cases. All of those showed as well to be negative. Together with the health authorities in Piraeus, we decided for another PCR test of those 12 crew members that were initially tested positive. Also, this test showed that all of those crew members were negative. So there are two things that I would like to say at this point. Our COVID-19 response plan was activated immediately, and we showed that we can trace immediately and that we can isolate very quickly. Also, it showed that the collaboration in those times are crucial. We were in contact with the health authorities as well as other authorities to figure out how we can proceed. Obviously, those plans were done before, and we strictly, together with the authorities, stick to those plans, and it worked out fine. So we are now in the check-out terminal here in Steinwerder, Hamburg, where our guests of the Mein Schiff 2 are currently leaving. As mentioned before, we have predefined timings for our guests. This is also mandatory for the checkout. We do have those predefined departure times, as Simone mentioned earlier, because we do not want to have too many guests at the same time inside the terminal in order to keep the distance. We also have a contactless checkout where guests simply put their boarding pass onto the counter and leave from there. We do have a one-way system implemented here in Steinwerder, where we use gangways obviously only in one direction at any given time. The wearing of personal protective equipment, for example the face mask, is mandatory inside the checkout terminal, and for our luggage handlers we also have implemented that they're using gloves at any time. Inside both terminals, the check-in terminal as well as the check-out terminal, we are enforcing a 1.5 meter distance at any given time in order to protect guests and crew. Also, we have placed markers on the seats so that not every seat is taken, and we keep a distance also when our guests or when crew is taking those seats. Once all guests have left the vessel, we are achieving a zero count. The zero count was implemented on all cruises of TUI Cruises in order to have a sanitation barrier in place. So we are now at the transfer bus station at the Steinwerder Cruise Terminal in Hamburg, and we have also made changes to our transfer bus system. We do have, as I mentioned before, predefined boarding and departure times. And also for the departure times, we have it set up in a way that we have guests constantly moving to the buses, but we don't have as many guests in front of the bus at any time. The coaches that we are using are disinfected before and after we use them. And also the wearing of a face mask is mandatory inside the bus. Also, the amount of guests on coaches is limited in order to allow sufficient spacing among the seats. TUI Cruises ground handling is also offering hand disinfection before the guests board the coach, and we are also enforcing a reduced capacity in accordance with local requirements. So it's not just only TUI requirements that are in place, but we're also taking a very close look on all the local requirements that are in place, so we meet those standards wherever we are currently sailing. So here we are in front of the Mein Schiff 2 in Steinwerder, Hamburg. We hope that the session was good for you and that you enjoyed it. From TUI Cruises' perspective, we would like to thank all the authorities that were involved, including and not only limited to the terminal operator. We have shown that cruises under COVID-19 conditions are possible and that they are safe. And this is our only goal, to make it safe as good as we can.
Thank you, Marcus. It was a great pleasure walking around with you at our terminal, and I hope you enjoyed the video.
TUI Cruises returned to service with Mein Schiff 2 on July 24, 2020, and we did send out a strong signal to the cruise and tourism industry. We all have experienced challenging months, and we all went above and beyond for our guests, for our fabulous crew, and for our shoreside teams. We certainly have seen better days. 4 months after the last guests have left our fleet, and during which we repatriated thousands of crew home, we were back. A lot of things became different. We adapted. Special circumstances require special measures. TUI Cruises was proud to announce a new comprehensive plan in response to the global COVID-19 situation, further reinforcing our principles of health, safety, and the preservation of well-being for all guests, crew, and members of the communities the Mein Schiff fleet calls. While the novel coronavirus COVID-19 outbreak poses unprecedented challenges to our industry and the world, TUI Cruises is confident that the sum of our long-standing proven procedures, along with the addition of new certified protocols and technologies, is strengthening our own principles to protect and to guarantee the health and safety of all guests, the crew on board the Mein Schiff fleet, service providers, and the population in the respective destinations at all times. TUI Cruises continuously monitors scientific developments in connection with the response to COVID-19. With the support of our own external medical expert, with expertise in emergency medicine, disaster management, infectiology, tropical and travel medicine, as well as industrial hygiene, and as scientific and health guidelines evolved, TUI Cruises will continue to review and update the measurements nimbly, adapting fleet-wide health, safety, and sanitation protocols. The worldwide development and spread of COVID-19 are constantly evaluated by considering the latest travel warnings, travel medicine recommendations, entry regulations, and local as well as national requirements for guests and crew. In consultation with the world's leading tourism group, the TUI AG, and the global cruise operator, Royal Caribbean Group, TUI Cruises has also developed a comprehensive infection prevention, control and treatment plan that ensures that the highest standards of sanitation and public health are met throughout every step of our future guests' vacation experience. All measures and processes of TUI Cruises' healthy return to service concept were developed by medical experts and are based on current guidelines and recommendation by the World Health Organization, by the German Robert Koch Institute, as well as the EU Healthy Gateways. With the present version of TUI Cruises' healthy return to service concept, the approval of the following ports as well as the respective authorities was received and enabled us to restart cruising out of the German ports as of July the 24th this year. For example, the flag state Malta, the German ports Hamburg, Kiel, and Bremerhaven, as well as the countries Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Greece, and Spain. For the resumption of cruise operations, TUI Cruises provided this comprehensive hygiene concept in advance to the respective port authorities, to port agencies, and wherever necessary to other relevant parties. This also applied to the scenic cruises without port calls, for example those along the Norwegian fjords. The following summary shows the main and new guiding principles introduced by TUI Cruises for the entire Mein Schiff fleet. TUI Cruises adjusted the load factor by reducing the guest and crew capacities. Introduction of an enhanced health questionnaire as well as an increased self and third-party medical anamnesis, for example temperature measurements, before the cruise, during embarkation, and during the stay on board. There are defined criteria for excluding guests from any cruise depending on the entered information and answers on the health questionnaire. The air conditioning system on board enables a 100% exchange of fresh air in all areas at all times. All guest cabins are supplied exclusively with fresh air from outside. The extracted exhaust air is discharged directly to the outside without mixing with supply air. In the isolation cabins, appropriate HEPA filters are installed in the existing recirculation units. In the crew cabins, the recirculation air is stopped and only fresh air is supplied. The extracted exhaust air is discharged directly to the outside without being mixed with the supply air. In the public areas, the amount of fresh air flow is increased accordingly, and the recirculated air is reduced to a minimum. Extensive and continuous communication of health and hygiene measures to guests before and during the cruise, including all service providers and our crew, to ensure compliance with the Code of Conduct and new regulations on board. All processes for guests and crew, for example, in port terminals, during embarkation and disembarkation, as well as in all guest and crew areas on board to comply with social distance and hygiene regulations. Reconstruction works to protect the crew on board, for example, equipping check-in counters and reception desk with perspex panels. The verification of the health and safety concept dealing with COVID-19 has been agreed with the SGS Institute Fresenius for the resumption of cruise operations. Therefore, the concept is based on a strict catalogue of measures that complies with the applicable legal requirements. A minimum distance of 1.5 meters applies on board the Mein Schiff fleet and in all port and terminal facilities, as well as on the pool deck of 2 meters. In the sports area, a minimum distance of 3 meters applies for all fitness courses and equipment-based training. The guest capacity for all public areas was adjusted to the current social distance regulations. Additional staff is employed on board and ashore for supervising and steering guest flows to avoid crowding. Information signs and floor markings support social distancing and compliance with the applicable regulations of at least 1.5 meters in all areas on board and in the port and terminal facilities. For guests and crew in direct contact, as well as in all public areas where the applicable social distance regulations are not possible to comply with, the wearing of a face mask is mandatory, except in restaurants and bars. This applies, for example, to corridors, staircases, and elevators. Wherever the minimum distance can be maintained, the wearing of a face mask is not mandatory. Additional protective and medical equipment is provided, including a real-time PCR test device to detect respiratory infections within 16 minutes. Embarkation and disembarkation of guests takes place separately at predefined times to generate a zero count. The predefined times are communicated prior to the start of the cruise or will be communicated prior to the end of the cruise on board the ship. The entire embarkation process, beginning with the arrival at the terminal for boarding, has been redesigned to reduce or avoid possible contact points as much as possible. There is a safety briefing on embarkation day. The capacity for each muster station was considerably reduced and is limited to small groups. Upon embarkation in the terminal, guests are informed to proceed immediately to their muster station after picking up their cabin cards from the cabin door. The muster stations are manned with crew members for a specific period of time. Social distance regulation of 1.5 meters will be considered and maintained during the complete safety briefing, which does not apply for families though. The participation of all guests is ensured through a registration process with electronic e-mustering devices. There are regulations for living and working on board. Each crew member must present a negative PCR test for SARS-CoV-2 upon arrival and before boarding. Each crew member is initially placed into isolation for a 14-day period after boarding the vessel and during the resumption of cruise operations. Only at the end of this period of isolation, and provided that no symptoms are present, the crew member will be considered fit for duty. All of our crew members are trained in dealing with COVID-19. Appropriate measures and processes for the operational safety and health have been implemented. For example, workplace safety, work equipment, and processes. At TUI Cruises, an outbreak prevention plan is to ward off the spread of infectious diseases. The outbreak prevention plan serves as a guideline for the prevention and control of infectious diseases. It includes measures and strategies, for example, inquiry of the state of health on embarkation, compliance with high hygiene and sanitation standards, the monitoring of suspected cases on board, the prevention of disease outbreaks, and procedures to contain an outbreak of diseases, including isolation protocols. TUI Cruises has developed a quarantine plan in response to the spread of COVID-19 and as a supplement to the outbreak prevention plan. The basis is the definition of infection control zones. There's a green zone for asymptomatic healthy persons. There's a yellow zone for contact group 2 as defined by the Robert Koch Institute in Germany. There's an orange zone for the contact group 1 as defined by the Robert Koch Institute, as well as asymptomatic persons with positive SARS-CoV-2 detection. And there's also a red zone. This is for symptomatic persons and persons with positive SARS-CoV-2 detection. Furthermore, the plan contains procedural instructions and measures for dealing with a suspected and/or confirmed COVID-19 case and a complete quarantine situation on board. The focus is on the implementation of an early warning system through which the infection process on board is continuously monitored, and minimal deviations from the norm are immediately detected. Thus, measures can be initiated immediately in case of abnormalities. The surveillance systems, the flu log, is divided into continuous monitoring of flu symptoms on the one hand, and the daily contactless body temperature measurement of all guests and crew on the Mein Schiff fleet on the other hand. As soon as the surveillance system registers abnormalities, measures are initiated. If the body temperature rises above 38 degrees Celsius, the ship's doctor carries out a secondary medical examination. TUI Cruises welcomes the development of the Corona Warn app by the Robert Koch Institute and the German federal government for tracing contact persons and recommends all guests and crew to use it. TUI Cruises is therefore recommending all guests and crew members to download the Corona Warn app onto their mobile device before starting their journey or before embarkation to use it on board. Using the Corona Warn app on board has been successfully tested and is possible via the free of charge Mein Schiff network on board. In coordination with the Robert Koch Institute, using the app on board and defining the process for the registration of guests who have been proven to be corona positive was successfully determined. TUI Cruises actively monitors, researches, and analyzes the development of further digital solutions for the determination, tracking, and tracing of contacts. In case of a positive SARS-CoV-2 detection, further measures will be taken on board. The requirements and regulations of the Outbreak Prevention Plan and the Quarantine Plan apply. The patient is immediately isolated in an isolation cabin located in the red zone. These cabins are situated in a designated and separate area on board. Access to fresh air is guaranteed through the balcony. Furthermore, the ventilation on board is configured for a 100% air exchange to keep the viral load within the premises as low as possible. The housekeeping team is specially educated for the cleaning and sanitation of the cabins and receives regular trainings in this topic. On board the Mein Schiff fleet, the latest molecular biological diagnostics can be used fully automatically to test for SARS-CoV-2 and 21 other respiratory pathogens within approximately 60 minutes. The medical staff receives a manufacturer's instruction as well as digital training documents, including videos, and additionally carries out regular weekly tests to be familiar with the handling. Real-time PCR supports both the identification of suspicious cases and the immediate introduction of further measures. All persons of the contact group 1, as defined by the Robert Koch Institute, are isolated in the orange zone on board. The index patient, as well as all other positive cases, are disembarked to a shoreside clinic. Now, how do we handle the medical disembarkation of a COVID-19 patient? In the event of a medical disembarkation, TUI Cruises collaborates with the experienced service provider Medcon team. In cooperation with local port authorities, possible risks in case of a medical disembarkation, as well as medical care in the destination, will be evaluated. For the crew, a special training with corresponding contents regarding the medical disembarkation of a COVID-19 patient was implemented. TUI Cruises is currently analyzing and defining safe home ports for each destination, which guarantees a stable medical and laboratory infrastructure and the highest quality standards, as well as an airport, hotel capacity, etc. The Minorizing Portal is a digital information platform and reservation system which is available to the guest before and during the cruise on board. The portal contains the following functionalities. For example, the entry of personal data into the ship's manifest, the online check-in and the entry of personal payment data, as well as advanced reservations of various services on board. The Minorizing Portal enables the guest to plan his or her trip conveniently via various mobile devices without having personal contact. TUI Cruises furthermore strengthens the online check-in. Digital check-in from home, in the office or on the road, saving time and avoiding contact points at the cruise terminal. For example, contactless check-in, completing manifest data and identification or passport data online, the upload of payment data and the implementation and booking of time slots for the staggered check-in, the boarding pass as a download, for example, to have access to the terminal or to the ship on the embarkation day. TUI Cruises has put a lot of effort into rewriting our terminal operations, including the embarkation and disembarkation. TUI Cruises encourages to implement the adapted process for terminal operations to ensure the highest standards of infection control during the arrival, embarkation, and disembarkation in the respective ports and destinations, as well as on board the Mein Schiff fleet, minimizing any risk of transmission. All guests, the entire crew, and all external staff are subject to the processes and health screening we have implemented. All contracted means of transportation, including transfer and shuttle buses on behalf of TUI Cruises, meet the highest hygiene standards and infection protocols. For the shuttle and transfer buses, the implementation of designated shuttle bus times according to the predefined check-in times for embarkation, which are communicated to the guests within their travel documents and via the Minorizing Portal. Sanitation of shuttle bus prior to the start and after the end of each deployment, for example, embarkation or disembarkation. The use of shuttle and transfer buses is only possible in those designated times. It is mandatory to wear a face mask at all times. The shuttle buses and transfer buses will be free of charge to enable a contactless embarkation, so the transfer vouchers will not be collected anymore. Hand disinfectant is provided to all guests before boarding the shuttle and transfer buses. A minimum distance of 1.5 meters will be kept during the embarkation and disembarkation of the coaches. The load factor and the dispatch of the shuttle and transfer buses are according to local regulations. For example, entering and exiting the bus for reaching the front seats via the front door and for reaching the back seats via the rear door. Entering and exiting the shuttle bus is only possible via the rear door. To ensure a minimum distance of 1.5 meters to the driver, the first row of seats are blocked. Let's talk a little bit about terminal standards and measures. All employees from the ship, the terminal, the port, and the ground handling will be required to maintain wearing protective equipment. Information on how to handle and dispose protective equipment is given, as well as face masks and disposable gloves. Hands have to be regularly thoroughly washed with soap and disinfected prior to the shift start or rotation, as well as during shifts. Shared equipment and tools are to be sanitized before, during, and after each shift, or any time equipment is transferred to a new employee, according to the guidelines of the Outbreak Prevention Plan. The terminal building and facilities inside the terminal, for example, security, sanitary, frequently touched surfaces, will be frequently cleaned and sanitized and will be consistent with the highest Outbreak Prevention Plan standards to ensure the highest hygiene standards of infection control. The cleaning has to be documented in a corresponding protocol by the terminal operator. Terminals remain closed until boarding time, and only cleared and vetted guests, crew, and personnel are to enter. Hand sanitizer dispensers will be placed throughout the terminal, for example, at the terminal entrance, in the embarkation area, and behind the security area. Touch points throughout the terminal will be minimized. A minimum distance of 1.5 meters during the entire arrival process will be maintained. Any area where guests, crew, or personal queue will have clear markings or natural barriers for the appropriate physical distancing. Seating areas are to be rearranged to promote personal spacing. Fixed seating areas in the terminals are prepared with a minimum distance of 1.5 meters. Signage on personal spacing, hand washing, and sanitizing, and the proper use and disposal of personal protective equipment, preventive measures, for example, coughing and sneezing etiquette, will be presented throughout the terminal. Guests, crew, daily visitors, and external service providers will have to perform a health screening, including a temperature check, before. Entry is allowed into the sanitation zone of the embarkation terminal and to the check-in area. The medical embarkation includes the following measures. A health questionnaire will be validated. Contactless body temperature check, for example, with thermal imaging cameras. The general health state of children will be closely monitored, and abnormalities and symptoms such as a runny nose may lead to further questioning. Elevated body temperature of or above 38 degrees Celsius or a positively answered question on the health questionnaire will lead to a consultation and examination by a physician, which will take place in a separated designed area inside the terminal. If COVID-19 or any other infectious disease is suspected, a real-time PCR test is required and carried out, and guests and their close contact are not allowed to enter the sanitary zone of the terminal nor board the vessel. The check-in for the cruise. After a successful medical embarkation, guests are allowed to enter the sanitary zone of the terminal for the cruise check-in. The previously voluntary option to do the online check-in before the start of the cruise is now compulsory for all guests in order to ensure that the embarkation is as touchless as possible and to avoid any contact points. The implementation of a staggered arrival time, which is communicated to the guests via the travel documents and the Minorizing Portal. Only guests are to enter the terminal in the predefined time slots and with appropriate face masks. There will be no access granted in case of an early arrival, outside the pre-communicated times. The load factor of the terminal building and guest capacity have been adapted. The check-in with mobile devices enables contactless scanning of the ID and passport documents and taking the security photo while maintaining the minimum distance of 1.5 meters. All guests are registered via mobile devices in the terminal. This shortens the length of the stay at the check-in. It now takes 40 seconds versus 2 minutes at the regular check-in. And it's furthermore contactless. There is no multi-page travel documentation, and the boarding pass with the barcode for the terminal entrance and access to the ship is provided prior to entering the terminal. The minimum distance of 1.5 meters is ensured by using check-in counters behind which the crew is positioned with mobile devices. Specially manufactured perspex panels are fixed to the check-in counters to provide additional protection. Also, our Mindshift crew members are to wear face masks. Crew members who also work in direct contact with the guests on board are preferred for check-in processes. Guest cabin cards are in an envelope at the cabin door, so the crew does not need to hand out cabin cards to guests during the embarkation. Following the embarkation process, a security screening is carried out, according to the guidelines and hygiene standards to minimize any risk of transmission of infectious diseases. Contactless daily health and temperature screening for security personnel. Also, a health questionnaire must be completed. A minimum distance of 1.5 meters during the entire security process, for example, through floor markings is maintained. Security personnel is required to wear appropriate protective equipment, for example, face masks and disposable gloves. Guests will be instructed to place their personal belongings into the safety baskets without touching these themselves. Security personnel equipped with disposable gloves places the safety baskets into the X-ray machine. Additional protection is provided by perspex panels, which will be fixed to the outside of the X-ray machines wherever possible. If a personal screening with physical contact is necessary, the disposable gloves of the security personnel must be disposed afterwards, and the control panel has to be sanitized. Guests take their personal belongings out of the safety basket after successfully completing the security screening without touching it during removal. Safety baskets will furthermore be sanitized and put back into circulation by the security personnel. Guests do follow the signage to the gangway, which is only used for boarding the ship. There's an access control to the gangway by crew members. A minimum distance of 1.5 meters will be guaranteed by using check-in counters. Additional protection through perspex panels, as well as the requirement to wear a face mask, as well as contactless access control. Guests do pass the gangway to the ship in a one-way traffic. The highest hygiene standards and infection protocols according to the Outbreak Prevention Plan will also be followed while handling luggage to minimize the risk of cross-contamination. External service providers will sanitize the ship's luggage trolleys after unloading from the ship onto the pier, as well as by the crew vice versa. Porter and external service providers to wear protective equipment, for example, face masks and disposable gloves. Guests arriving individually drop their luggage at the baggage drop-off point contactless. Porters will take the luggage out of the transfer buses for guests who have booked their travel arrangements with TUI Cruises. External service providers who wear appropriate protective equipment will wipe down the luggage handles before being carried on board. Crew who will wear appropriate protective equipment will wipe down the luggage handles before these are delivered to the guests as well. In order to keep the risk of infection as low as possible during the short cruises that we have, for example, those 3 and 4 night cruises, it is obligatory for guests to carry their luggage during the departure themselves. If necessary, however, porters will assist with appropriate protective equipment, for example, face masks and disposable gloves. Guests with special needs will only be supported with appropriate protective equipment. For cruises starting and ending in foreign ports and/or cruises with a duration of more than 4 days, an adapted luggage service in compliance with hygiene and sanitation measures will be offered. For all activities that take place in the port and/or on the pier, the highest hygiene standards and infection protocols are applied in accordance with the Outbreak Prevention Plan to minimize any risk of transmission of infectious diseases. A minimum distance of 1.5 meters must always be maintained. Health and contactless body temperature screenings will have to be performed for all personnel working on the pier, including drivers. Furthermore, a health questionnaire must be completed. Personnel must wear appropriate protective equipment, face mask, and disposable gloves. Documents will only be countersigned while wearing protective equipment and using own pens. Crew access to the pier shall be kept to a minimum and shall only be carried out when taking precautions. The newly defined processes for handling guests in the terminal to prevent infections combine the highest standards of hygiene and include extensive measures to minimize any risk of transmission of infectious diseases upon departure. The implementation of predefined disembarkation times, which are communicated to the guests via the departure information on board. It will be possible to control the number of guests in the gangway area, terminal, and at the transfer, as well as shuttle buses. Leaving the ship is only possible in the previously communicated staggered times and with appropriate face masks. Guests will be managed to not debark prior to the designated times. The occupancy rate of the terminal building and guest capacity have been adapted. All guests must leave the ship latest by the fixed time before embarkation is starting in order to achieve a zero count. The risk of cross-contamination between arriving and departing guests will therefore be reduced. It enables time to comprehensively clean and sanitize all cabins and public areas. The cabin cards will be autonomously scanned at the security check-in desk to ensure contactless checkout. A minimum distance of 1.5 meters is guaranteed by using the security check-in counters. Additional protection through perspex panels at the security check-in. Guests leave the ship via designated departure gangways in order to have a one-way traffic, and there's continuous cleaning of the gangway area. While leaving the ship, a contactless body temperature check is taking place for all guests. In the event of an elevated body temperature of or above 38 degrees Celsius, a diagnostic clarification and, if necessary, a medical disembarkation will be carried out. Guests are made aware to contact TUI Cruises customer service department after the end of their cruise if they develop any symptoms related to COVID-19 via the departure information and travel documents. While in pre-COVID-19 times, TUI Cruises checked in between 1,200 and 1,500 guests per hour, we are currently checking in roughly 500 guests per hour and limit the capacity of guests inside the terminal to not more than 200 at any given point of time. By deploying all available security lines inside the check-in terminal and the staffing the check-in to maximum capacity, a continuous flow is guaranteed. In response of the COVID-19 situation, the already existing and very high hygiene standards on board the Mein Schiff fleet has been extended, and additional measures have been implemented. All surfaces are regularly cleaned and sanitized. Handrails, elevator buttons, or touchscreens are cleaned and sanitized frequently, every 30 minutes. Frequently visited areas, for example the gangway, are cleaned and sanitized at shorter intervals, if necessary continuously. Housekeeping staff wear face masks as well as disposable gloves at work. Each area is cleaned according to a specific procedure, which is defined and documented in a protocol. The time and intervals for cleaning and sanitation are defined and regulated in a comprehensive plan which is adjusted as necessary. On the Mein Schiff fleet, the well-being of the crew is particularly close to our heart. For this reason, we have, of course, taken special protective measures and set the highest standards of hygiene to avoid any risk of infection as much as possible. Each crew member must present a medical certificate of fitness for work before boarding. Each crew member must also present a negative PCR test for SARS-CoV-2 at boarding. And each crew member must complete a health questionnaire. The body temperature of each crew member must be taken before entering the vessel, and each crew member must undergo a safety training course before arrival, which also includes information on COVID-19. Each crew member receives a clear plan of conduct, with the most important points, including behavior in the days prior to arrival, behavior on arrival on board, and behavior when symptoms occur. A declaration of consent to comply with the code of conduct must be signed. Each crew member is required to observe the appropriate rules of conduct on arrival, for example, wearing a face mask, washing hands regularly, and coughing and sneezing etiquette. The arrival of each crew member is planned as risk-free as possible, with few transfers and no travel from or via risk areas. Each crew member is initially placed into isolation for a 14-day period after boarding the vessel, during the resumption of cruise operations. Only after the end of this isolation period, and if no symptoms are present, the crew member is considered fit for duty. The body temperature of each crew member is measured at least twice a day in a contactless way. Each crew member is also provided with special protective equipment depending on the work location and the associated contact with guests or other crew members. This might include an FFP2 mask, a washable face mask, disposable gloves, safety goggles, or full body protection. Each crew member receives special trainings on the code of conduct and current processes, hygiene measures, and behavior regarding COVID-19 before the start of the contact and immediately after embarkation on board. The code of conduct is displayed clearly in all crew venues, for example, the onboard restaurant for the crew. In addition, each crew member receives this information in the cabin. A communication guideline has been implemented for this purpose. Measures are taken to avoid large groups and unnecessary contacts, for example, better management of break time leisure activities. Each crew member has sufficient soap and hand disinfectant in the cabin available as well. Each crew member has access to dispensers with skin protection cream in several places. In addition, the crew members are invited to use them by posters and notices. Crew members are accommodated in single cabins as far as possible. It is not possible, however, to change cabins. During the contract period, the crew member remains on the same ship. I would like to sincerely thank each and everyone who supported in this endeavor. It made all the difference, and every single day makes this difference. More challenges will come, solutions will be found. Thank you to port authorities, health authorities, port agencies, terminal operators, ground handlers, tour operators, and all those helping hands that supported in the last months. Thank you for the trust and commitment we have received by our crews, our employees, the authorities, and our partners. We are in this together, and we will be back together. In our thoughts, we stand together with our colleagues and crews across the industry. There will be better days. Thank you very much.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for attending the end of the journey. One cruise ends, another begins. And of course, a huge thank you to Marcus and Simone for giving us insight into how turnarounds have worked so far at one of the first North European ports to do so. Enjoy the rest of Seatrade Cruise Virtual. Bye.